Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the source material you send and really get our hands dirty.
I like that. Getting our hands dirty.
Yeah. And today, we're diving into a legal case that caught your eye.
Rathwell versus Shorey.
Yeah, a car accident case, but with a twist. It's not about who's at fault, because in this one, the defendant actually admits liability from the get-go.
That's right. So we're going beyond the typical he said, she said of liability. This deep dive takes us straight into the fascinating world of expert witness discrepancies.
Because, as you can imagine, things get complicated when it comes to the question of damages, specifically how much compensation the plaintiff should receive.
Precisely. And Rathwell versus Shorey really throws a spotlight on just how influential those differing expert opinions can be in swaying a legal outcome, even when we're dealing with what seems like a relatively straightforward situation.
So we've got the BC Supreme Court's judgment from August 27th, 2024, all prepped and ready. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I think it'd be helpful to set the stage a bit, lay down some groundwork, just in case any of our listeners are new to how civil lawsuits work.
Absolutely. A little legal literacy never hurts.
So in the simplest terms, you've got the plaintiff, in this case Jessica Rathwell, claiming she sustained some serious injuries from a car accident. And then you've got the defendant, Travis Shorey, who, as we've established, caused the accident.
Right. And the judgment we're dissecting focuses specifically on that post-accident phase, specifically the question of damages, that's the financial compensation awarded to the plaintiff for their losses, whatever those losses might be.
And let me tell you, the stakes are high in this one. Rathwell is claiming over $3 million in damages.
A substantial sum, to say the least.
Meanwhile, Shorey, while admitting fault, argues that her injuries aren't as severe as she claims, and therefore don't warrant that level of compensation.
Hence the need for experts to weigh in.
And boy, did they ever. Each side brought in a whole team of medical experts to support their claims, which was where things get really interesting.
Because it essentially becomes a battle of medical opinions, with each side presenting experts who can interpret the evidence in a way that strengthens their case.
It's like a legal tug-of-war, with medical experts representing each side.
And the rope they're pulling on is the interpretation of the evidence.
Exactly. Okay, so let's set the scene. September 20, 2017. What can you tell us about the accident itself?
Well, from the judgment, it seems like a fairly standard rear-end collision. No crazy weather conditions, no high-speed chase, nothing out of the ordinary.
And the players. We know Rathwell was an elementary school teacher at the time.
Yes, and that detail becomes quite significant later on when we look at the damages being claimed, particularly the aspect of lost earning capacity. But as for Shorey, well, the judgment focuses mainly on his role as the defendant, the one who caused the accident.
Okay, so the who is less important than the what in this case. It's not about who caused the accident, but about the nature and severity of Rathwell's injuries and how those injuries have impacted her life.
And those injuries, specifically the possibility of something called a mild traumatic brain injury, or MTBI, are at the heart of this whole expert witness showdown.
Right, and for our listeners who aren't familiar with MTBI, it's often referred to as a concussion. And unlike a broken bone, it's not always straightforward to diagnose.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's what we call an invisible injury. You can't always see it on a standard X-ray or scan. Diagnosis often hinges on the person's reported symptoms, which, as you can imagine, can be subjective and differ greatly from person to person.
Which makes it even more complicated when you've got these expert witnesses weighing in, right?
Exactly. They're interpreting those subjective experiences, those reported symptoms, through the lens of their own expertise and potentially the interests of the party that hired them.
Which is precisely what happened in Rathwell v. Shorey. But before we get to that, let's back up a bit. Let's retrace Rathwell's experience, starting right after the accident. The judgment mentions she went straight to the emergency room. So, what did the ER doctors find?
Well, they noted a minor head injury, but what's interesting is there's no explicit mention of a concussion diagnosis at that time.
So no major alarm bells going off right away?
Not initially. The next day, she sees her family doctor, Dr. Chung. He notes some pretty standard post-accident complaints. A bit of neck pain, headaches, some dizziness. She was understandably pretty banged up.
Makes sense. It was a car accident after all.
Right, but here's where it gets interesting. Over the next few months, these complaints start to escalate. She begins reporting fatigue, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, things that weren't initially as prominent.
Okay, so a delayed onset of some of these more subtle symptoms.
Yes, and this is key because it plays a major role in those conflicting expert opinions later on. It wasn't until 2020, a full 3 years after that initial car accident, that Dr. Chung refers her to a concussion clinic.
3 years. That seems like a long time to wait if the symptoms were severe, wouldn't you say?
And that's a point that the judge really keyed in on. It raised questions about when Rathwell's symptoms became severe enough to suggest something like an MTBI, and whether that timeline aligned with the typical progression of such an injury.
Which sets the stage for our upcoming exploration into the battle of the medical minds.
Precisely. Both sides called in their A-teams, neurologists, ophthalmologists, psychiatrists, each with their own interpretations of the same case.
So this is where the case takes this fascinating turn. We're shifting gears from a car accident and venturing into, like, the wilderness of medical diagnosis, especially with something like MTBI.
Right, because it's not always as clear-cut as, say, a broken bone.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where the role of those expert witnesses becomes, well, so crucial and potentially like a source of major disagreement.
Absolutely. Because when you're dealing with something like MTBI, where the symptoms can be so subjective and varied, interpretation becomes paramount.
Okay, so let's meet these medical masterminds. Who are the key players and what were their takes on Rathwell's condition?
All right, so starting with the neurologists, the brain injury specialists, right?
Yeah, the folks who really know their stuff when it comes to the human brain.
Exactly. On Shori's side, you've got Dr. Weber. She reviews Rathwell's medical records, all those doctor visits, and concludes that an MTBI is, well, possible, but not probable.
Okay, so not ruling it out completely, but leaning towards unlikely? What was her reasoning there?
Well, Dr. Weber points to a couple of key factors. First, the absence of those, like, classic concussion signs immediately after the accident. Remember, the ER doctor noted a minor head injury, but there was no loss of consciousness, no disorientation reported.
Right, no flashing red lights at that point.
Exactly. And in Dr. Weber's view, that lack of immediate red flags sort of weakens the case for a delayed onset MTBI. Then there's the possibility of other factors that might be mimicking those same symptoms. Dr. Weber suggests that, anxiety, which is a completely normal response to a traumatic experience like a car accident, could be playing a role in what Rathwell is describing.
Which really highlights the challenge with this type of diagnosis, right? It's not always as simple as this equals that.
It's rarely black and white. And on that note, let's bring in Dr. Meehan, the neurologist testifying for Rathwell. Now, he reaches a completely different conclusion. He did diagnose an MTBI, basing his opinion on those symptoms she reported even years later.
Whoa, okay, so we have two qualified neurologists, same information, but they're miles apart in their conclusions. This must have given the judge a serious brain teaser, wouldn't you say?
You could say that again. And it brings up a question that goes way beyond this particular case. Like, how is anyone, even a judge, supposed to sort through these conflicting expert opinions? Because let's face it, it's not just a courtroom problem. We encounter these kinds of situations all the time.
You're right. Whether we're scrolling through online articles or listening to talking heads debate, we're constantly bombarded with different opinions, different interpretations of the same facts. So how do we, the listeners, navigate this? How do we avoid getting swept away?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer, or at least part of it, is critical thinking.
Okay, I like the sound of that. So critical thinking, break it down for us. What does that look like in action, especially when we're faced with these conflicting viewpoints?
It means not just accepting things at face value, even if they're coming from someone with a fancy title or impressive credentials. It's about asking the right questions, digging a little deeper.
So not about dismissing expertise, but about engaging with it actively. I'm all for that. Give us the lowdown. What are those key questions we should be asking?
Well, first and foremost, who is this expert? What's their background? What are their credentials? And what makes them qualified to be an authority on this specific topic? In the case of our neurologists, we'd want to know, are they board certified? Do they have experience specifically with MTBI? Have they published any research on this topic? Get a feel for their street cred, so to speak.
Credentials check. Got it. What's next on our critical thinking checklist?
Next, you've got to be aware of potential biases. Is this expert being paid by one of the parties involved? Do they have any known affiliations or a particular stance that might be coloring their interpretation of the evidence? Everyone has a perspective, even experts.
So understanding the context, the landscape in which these opinions are formed, It's not about jumping to conclusions or assuming bad intentions, but just being aware that those influences exist.
Exactly. And this is especially important in a legal setting like Rathwell v. Shorey, because these expert witnesses aren't just there to offer neutral opinions, they're advocating for a specific outcome.
Makes sense. They've been hired by one side to present the evidence in the most favorable light for their client.
Okay, so we've scrutinized the experts. What about the evidence itself? What should we be looking for there? Right, so once you've considered the source, you've got to evaluate the substance of what they're saying. Does their opinion actually align with the available evidence? Are they cherry-picking data to support a predetermined conclusion? Are they basing their opinions on well-established research, or is it more about their own interpretation?
So it's about making sure those arguments are built on solid ground.
Precisely. And then look for consistency. Does what they're saying fit with the bigger picture? Does it contradict other evidence? In this case, remember how the judge ultimately found certain aspects of Rathwell's testimony to be unreliable? Well, that then casts a bit of a shadow on the opinions of those experts who relied heavily on her self-reporting.
It's all connected, like a domino effect. If one piece is off, it can throw the whole thing into question.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to ask, are there other possible explanations for what we're seeing? Just like Dr. Weber suggested that anxiety could be a contributing factor to Rathwell's symptoms, could there be other things at play that haven't been fully explored?
So critical thinking is about being a bit of a detective. You're not just looking for a convenient answer. You're looking at all the angles, considering all the possibilities.
You got it. And you've got to be comfortable with a little bit of uncertainty, because sometimes there isn't one clear-cut answer.
Okay, this is really eye-opening. I can already feel my brain switching gears, starting to apply these questions to everything I hear, not just, expert opinions in a courtroom.
And that's the beauty of it. These critical thinking skills are like a superpower we can use in all aspects of our lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to Rathwell v. Shorey. We've got our dueling neurologists, but the plot thickens because it's not just them. We've got this whole panel of specialists stepping into the ring.
Right, it's a veritable medical conference in that courtroom.
Exactly. And remember, those ophthalmologists, they were in a tizzy about whether Rathwell's headaches qualified as chronic post-traumatic migraines.
Right, even that specific diagnosis was up for debate.
So even within a specialized field, there's room for disagreement. It really highlights how much of this comes down to interpretation. It's not always a simple equation.
It rarely is. And then, of course, we have the psychiatrists offering their perspectives on her mental health.
Ah, yes. Another layer of complexity. What were their takes on the situation?
Well, this is where we really get into the challenge of cause and effect. They were trying to untangle. Were Rathwell's anxiety and depression a direct result of the accident? Were they pre-existing conditions, or was it some combination of the two?
Which makes sense, because it's not always easy to pinpoint the root cause of mental health challenges, especially when you're talking about something that happened years earlier.
Exactly. Life is messy. Our experiences intertwine, they leave their marks, and untangling those threads, pinpointing the cause of something as complex as human behavior, is no easy feat. That's why these experts are often called upon in these cases to provide context, to analyze patterns, to try to make sense of a very intricate web of factors.
It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces keep shifting.
And that's precisely what the judge was up against in Rathwell v. Shorey.
Right, because he had to sift through all of these expert opinions, some directly contradicting each other, and determine how much weight to give each one. How did he even begin to make sense of it all?
That is the million-dollar question. And before we answer it, let's take a moment to acknowledge something crucial that often gets missed in these discussions.
Okay, I'm listening. What's often missed?
The human element. Imagine being Jessica Rathwell. You're dealing with these real symptoms, real challenges, your life has been turned upside down, and now you're in this legal battle, your experience is being dissected and debated. It's easy to get caught up in the technicalities, the legal arguments, the expert opinions, but at the heart of it, there's a person who's hurting. And that's something we can't afford to forget.
So well said. This isn't just a case study, it's someone's life.
Exactly. And with that in mind, let's delve into how the judge navigated this complex web of expert opinions and reached his decision on the damages.
It really makes you stop and think,
Yeah,
Behind all those legal terms and expert testimonies, there are real lives being impacted.
absolutely. And it's the judge's job to sort through all of that, to weigh the evidence, to consider the human cost, and then ultimately to make a decision that's fair and just based on the information presented.
So having heard from all these specialists with their differing opinions and interpretations, what did the judge decide? Did he rule that Rathwell did in fact suffer an MTBI as a result of that car accident back in 2017?
Well, this is where the judge's analysis gets really interesting. Remember all that evidence we talked about? The initial medical reports, the testimonies from all those experts, and of course, Rathwell's own descriptions of her symptoms and how they've impacted her life. He considered all of it. And ultimately, he found that there wasn't enough solid evidence to definitively support that MTBI diagnosis.
Okay, so no MTBI, according to the judge. But what about all those other injuries she sustained? The
Yeah.
neck pain, the headaches, those were real,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And the judge acknowledges that. He confirms that she did, in fact, suffer those soft tissue injuries, and that those injuries have caused her ongoing pain, and that this pain is a direct result of the car accident. And this is an important distinction the judge makes. He's acknowledging the validity of her pain and suffering, even without confirming that MTBI diagnosis.
Right, because pain is pain, regardless of what you call it.
Exactly. And that brings us, of course, to that big question, the one we've been dancing around this whole time. What about the money?
Right, the damages. Rathwell was asking for over $3 million. So did she get it?
Well, not quite. The judge awarded her $544,110 in damages.
Okay, still a significant amount of money, but considerably less than what her legal team was hoping for. So how did the judge arrive at that specific figure? It's not like he just pulled it out of a hat, right?
Definitely not. Calculating damages in a personal injury case like this one is a complex process with lots of factors to consider. It's not as simple as just saying, well, she was off work for X amount of time, so let's just pay her for those missed days. The court goes much deeper than that, taking into account a whole range of factors to figure out what a fair and just outcome would be.
Break it down for us. What are those factors? How did he get to that $544,110?
Right, so the judge breaks it down into several categories: non-pecuniary damages, special damages, past income loss, future income loss, and future care costs. Let's unpack those, shall we?
Yes, please. Starting with non-pecuniary damages. What a mouthful. What does that even mean?
So non-pecuniary damages, think of it as compensation for the things that are, well, harder to put a precise price tag on. Things like pain and suffering, loss of enjoyment of life that could be hobbies she can no longer enjoy, relationships that have been strained, you name it. It's about acknowledging that even if you can't put an exact dollar amount on those experiences, they still represent a very real loss to the person who's experienced them.
So in Rathwell's case, it's about recognizing that the impact of this accident goes beyond just those physical injuries and lost wages.
Exactly. And the judge, in this case, he awarded her $125,000 in non-pecuniary damages.
Okay, that's a pretty sizable chunk of that total amount. What about those special damages you mentioned?
Ah, yes. Special damages, those are a bit more concrete. They cover the actual expenses she incurred because of the accident. Think medical bills, therapy costs, medication, even those travel expenses associated with getting treatment, anything with receipts.
So the things that have a paper trail.
Exactly. In Rathwell's case, those special damages added up to $70,000.
Okay, so that leaves us with what could be the big one, that lost earning capacity. And this is where things get especially tricky, right? Because Rathwell actually switched careers after the accident. So how do you even begin to calculate future earnings when someone's career trajectory has taken such a turn?
You're absolutely right. That's where it gets really complicated. And that's where those expert witnesses we talked about earlier really come into play. Those economists, the vocational specialists, they provide their analyses looking at her age, her education, her previous work history, both as a teacher and then as a counselor, and the potential impact of those injuries on her ability to work and earn a living in the future. It's about comparing what she was on track to earn before the accident with what she can realistically expect to earn now, given her injuries and this new career path.
So a lot of projecting and estimating, trying to create this picture of what her life would have looked like if that car accident had never happened.
And then trying to quantify that difference, which is no easy feat.
Right. So what did the judge decide when it came to those lost earnings?
So he awarded her $55,000 for past income loss, covering that time from the accident up until the trial. But the bigger chunk, the one that really stands out, is the $260,000 awarded for future income loss.
Wow, that's significant.
Yeah.
What's the rationale behind such a substantial sum for future income loss?
It comes down to this: even though the judge didn't find that slam dunk evidence to support the MTBI diagnosis, he recognized that those ongoing symptoms, things like the pain, the fatigue, the difficulty concentrating, all those things she described, They could very well limit her ability to work as much as she would have been able to before the accident, even in her new career as a counselor.
So it's a nuanced decision. He's not saying she can't work at all. He's saying that her earning potential has likely been negatively impacted because of this accident.
Precisely. And that brings us to the last piece of this financial puzzle, future care costs.
Right. Those would be things like, what, ongoing medical treatment, maybe therapy, to help her manage the pain and adjust to those limitations.
Exactly. And the judge awarded $34,110 for those future care costs. He's acknowledging that the impact of an accident often lasts much longer than those initial injuries. It's about making sure she has access to the resources she needs to move forward.
So this financial award, it's not just about addressing the past, it's about helping her navigate the future.
Exactly. It's about giving her the best possible shot at a full recovery, recognizing that her path might look different than it would have otherwise.
This whole deep dive has been, well, a lot to process. We've gone from a car accident to the intricacies of the human brain, explored the world of expert witnesses and legal battles, and really confronted the human cost of these events.
It's a reminder that the law is about so much more than just rules and regulations. It's about people, their experiences, and their stories. And sometimes it's about trying to make things right when those stories take an unexpected turn.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
Until next time, remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about the world around us, the better equipped we are to navigate its complexities.
And who knows what fascinating cases await us in our next deep dives. Until then, keep those questions coming.